Thank you for coming. Before I introduce our speaker of tonight, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Ahmad Siddiq. I'm the head of the Egyptology Society, and the Mathematics Society, and the Alice Society. And Alice is Arabic literature in the classic era. So if you are interested, later in the semester I will be giving a lecture bearing the title of my book, Conquering the City of Grammar, which I gave last semester. Also, we would like to act as part of the Egyptology Society, an ancient Egyptian story. And some of us are already working on this edition. And that's why, if you would like to be part of the team, organizing team, or just be on my mailing list for lectures, you can email me everywhere. And before I introduce Dr. Swanson, I would like to render infinite thanks to my team, to Kirsten, to Darcy, and more importantly to Osman, the head of the logistics, and Crystal Ballot, my PR specialist, who did a good job in publicizing this. This is a word for a soldier in Egypt, for an army, Michelle. And a week from today, on Tuesday the 10th, we will be offering iftar and a lecture titled Give a Pharaoh Fire, the meaning of the name of the pharaohs, and interesting stories about it. Okay, last week we had Dr. Mccarrans speaking about mummification and about physical modes of seeking immortality. With the advent of Christianity, we have higher ways of spirituality, of monastic way of being immortal. And the best scholar to speak on this subject is Dr. John Swanson, whose great erudition is informed directly from the field and from reading. At PUC, he is Associate Provost and the Director of the core curriculum, and actually we can go forever, we can easily do a whole biography, a history of Dr. Swanson. But the best way to introduce Dr. Swanson is to enjoy a monastic masterpiece from the Swansonian school. Dr. Swanson.
Thank you, Ahmed. I don't know what any of that means, but... Okay, I need to make a quick comment on two things. One, this is going to be at a fairly straightforward and perhaps a bit simple level. And I know for a fact there are several of you in this audience who know the subject as well, and in many cases better than I. So I would like to make a quick preliminary apology to those of you for whom this is going to be very familiar stuff. The second thing is I need to warn you in advance. When I got into this and started putting it together, I probably got too ambitious. In this sense, I'm going to be violating one of the basic requirements of the monastic life that we'll be talking about in a few moments, and that is to try to avoid talkativeness, which is the term that's used in Greek, and that's about the best translation into English that one can give, and to make extensive use of intelligent silence as a way of coming to terms with the world. I fear you're going to be subject to far too much talkativeness. And I should warn you in advance that this is going to be a very text-heavy talk. You're sitting here in the semi-darkness, and a good half or more of the slides you're going to see are actually going to be texts, or at least selections from texts that go back to 1,500 to 1,600 years ago. Partly because I think if you want to begin addressing the issue of what monasticism is or how it is developed, you need to have a familiarity with some of these texts. The texts, for the most part, I think, are intrinsically quite interesting, though I'll find a way to make them unbelievably boring. But I just wanted to prepare you for that. There are a number of images like the one that's up here. In fact, this may be the finest image of the things that I will show you. Can you all hear me okay if I speak at this level? Do I need a microphone or anything like that? Okay, if you find it hard to hear me, let me know. Because one problem is that I'm going to be needing to look back and forth so that I can also see what's there and then what's on the screen here. Okay, let me begin at the beginning with the slide that you're looking at, and particularly the image on the right. My guess is that there are a few of you in here who have seen this. And if you did, it was probably in one of two circumstances. Either you had been to the Monastery of St. Catherine's, either before they built their new museum or after, and one way or another you saw the extraordinary collection of Eastern religious art that the monastery preserved. It is perhaps the greatest collection and most comprehensive collection of Greek icons in the world, and one of the finest of the icons that survives in the collection of the monastery is this 10th or 11th century icon, this wonderful image of a ladder. And I hope you can see, climbing up the ladder is a long sequence of gentlemen with relatively long robes. These are monks who are making their way up a ladder, and up there in the upper right-hand corner you can see where they're heading. They're on their way to heaven, where they're going to be greeted by Jesus if they get there. Unfortunately, you will notice that a number of them are having problems. There are devils above and devils below. In the upper left-hand corner, there is a chorus of angels that's encouraging them on as they're making their way up these steps. I mean, it's an interesting painting. Lots of people have seen it. It's a very dramatic image. It is beautifully done. As I said, this is in the collection of the Monastery of St. Catherine's, and if I'm taking a few moments at the beginning to emphasize this, I hope that all of you who have not been there will find the opportunity to go to the monastery, both because the monastery itself is fascinating, because the physical locale is unsurpassed, but the collection of paintings in the monastery, which are Greek Orthodox icons, is absolutely unequaled anywhere in the world. It is the only place in the world where you can see Greek icons that go back before the 8th and 9th centuries, for example. I mentioned a moment ago that there might have been one of two venues where you could have seen this icon. Some of you might remember that in the last 15 years, the Metropolitan Museum in New York has held several major blockbuster expositions on Byzantine art. And the exhibition that dealt with art of what's called the Middle Byzantine period, around the 10th and 11th and 12th centuries, had as its centerpiece this icon. Since the 19th century, the monastery had never allowed icons out of its possession, and that was the first time that that had happened since several of the most famous icons in the monastery were almost literally stolen in the 19th century. But that's where you might have seen this, and this is where I want to begin. This is an illustration of a religious text that was produced by one of the monks of the Monastery of St. Catherine's some 400 years before this icon was painted. Again, the icon dates to the 10th or 11th centuries. The icon is an image of the Ladder of Ascent, which is the title of a book written at the beginning of the 7th century by one of the brethren at the Monastery of St. Catherine's, a man who became the abbot at the monastery at the end of his life. His name was St. John, and he has been known ever since as St. John Climacus, which means St. John of the Ladder. That's because he wrote a book about a ladder of ascent. And what I wanted to do was to start out by saying a little bit about that book. Again, many of you have been to the Monastery of St. Catherine's, nestled in between these two mountains where you see the trees in the center. That's where St. John Climacus was 1,400 years ago, and in fact outside of the walls of the monastery, at a distance of about 4 or 5 kilometers, if you hike enough through the desert, you can find his cell, which is still preserved by the monks and which is regularly visited by them. Now, St. John Climacus wrote the Ladder of Ascent. And I'm beginning with this because if you're trying to talk about the origins of monasticism, and you want to try to begin by saying what monasticism was, much less what it is, there are so many different ways of approaching it that you have to start somewhere. And I thought I would start with St. John at the beginning of the 7th century, at a moment when monasticism, after some 200 to 300 years of development, had become one of the dominant cultural and social forces in all of the Mediterranean world. At a moment just before Islam will make its way into the Mediterranean world, at a moment when the Roman Empire has become Christian, and the Christian Roman Empire, what many people call the Byzantine Empire, dominates the Mediterranean world. This was written somewhere in the probably 610s, 620s, 630s of the Common Era. And if you get that date, you realize this is written just at the time that the Prophet Muhammad is receiving his revelations, just before the Muslim Arabs will be coming out of the Arabian Peninsula. It's a period when all sorts of cultural change is taking place in the Mediterranean world, and the institution of Christian monasticism is right at the heart of much of this cultural, social, political, and religious change. And the book that St. John wrote was very widely distributed. It's a book that is very familiar to anybody in the Greek Orthodox tradition today. And it's, I think, a very nice summation of what the monastic life is all about, or at least what it was thought to be about in the 7th century of the Common Era. Now, as I said, it's called the Ladder of Ascent. It begins with a brief introduction, and then it goes on to list 30 steps that a monk should follow if a monk hopes to make his way to heaven, to eventually be received into heaven by God. 30 steps, like 30 steps on a ladder. And that's where the idea of St. John Climacus, St. John of the Ladder, or St. John of the Steps, comes into his name. Now, it begins with this introduction, and forgive me because I'm going to be reading parts of some of the things that I'm putting on the board, but this is because it's important to understand if you want to address what monasticism was and how it developed. St. John wrote, "It is right that our treatise should deal with the warriors and athletes of Christ." Let me stop right here. Any of you who have done any casual reading about early Christianity or addressed the subject of monasticism will have encountered a term like the athletes of Christ or the warriors of Christ. Because by the 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era, when monasticism was just beginning, that is a term that was increasingly being used to describe what many regarded as a both strange and fascinating phenomenon of Christians simply leaving their possessions behind, leaving their families behind, abandoning their homes, leaving their towns and villages, and then going off in search of a life of solitude. A life lived in pursuit of a unique religious vocation, but in separation from lay society. These were the warriors and athletes of Christ. That became the term by which monks were known. St. John Climacus acknowledges this at the beginning of the 7th century. He says, "We ought not to omit in our writing a clear description of the weapons of those noble fighters, of the shield of faith which they hold up before God, and with which they ward off all thought of unbelief or backsliding, of the spiritual sword that is always drawn and lays low every selfish longing, of the iron breastplate of meekness and patience to warn off every insult." And in some ways, by the way, some of the metaphors here are deliberately clashing. The iron breastplate and the meekness and the mildness. Every jab and missile is warded off, and of the protective prayer of their spiritual master, which they have as a saving helmet. They do not stand with their feet close together, but one foot is advanced towards service, while the other stays firmly planted in prayer. Which I think, by the way, is one of the finest descriptions of what the idea of a warrior monk is. Not of a warrior monk, excuse me, of the phrase athletes of Christ meant to those who made use of that phrase. Now, one of the reasons why I wanted to begin with this is that for any of you who have been to, for example, Coptic monasteries that have a full scheme of religious painting, or those of you I hope will be going if you've not visited the Monastery of St. Paul or the Monastery of St. Anthony of the Red Sea Mountains, if you understand the complex metaphors that are associated with the term warrior of, first of all, of a military saint, of an athlete for Christ, of a warrior for Christ, and the way in which you seem to have these clashing images, that actually begins to help understand why many of the painting schemes of medieval churches in Egypt were laid out the way they were. This is a photograph of part of the interior of the great monastery of St. Anthony, which is in the Red Sea Mountains. And again, I hope very much that you'll have a chance to visit this if you have not, because the paintings in the great church are magnificent. They date to the 13th and 14th centuries, and they have recently been superbly restored so that you can see them in almost all of the glory in which they were originally painted. You're looking in the center of the photograph, rising up and dominating at the great keep of the monastery. But to the right, where you see two domes and then a bell tower in the distance, that's the great church of St. Anthony. This is an interior view of the great church of St. Anthony. It's laid out as a rectangle on a line from the west to the east. You enter in the west where you have two sections to the nave, or the main standing area of the church. This is looking down the length of the church from the western end to the eastern end. And at the far distance of the photograph, you can see the sanctuary area, but you're standing in the western part of the nave, and then there's an arch that gives you access to a second part of the nave. Now, it might sound that this is kind of silly. Why am I saying western nave, eastern nave, two parts to the nave? Because in the entry parts to the church, where you would go and stand if you were a monk who was attending services or a visitor attending the church, you would have been in one of these two areas. And the first area you would have come into is the first area of the nave, which is covered by a dome. And the painting scheme here is all focused on military saints. Figures like these. This is St. George over on the left, St. Phoidamon over on the right. These are two famous saints in the Coptic tradition. They were both military men who were martyred for the faith at the beginning of the 4th century. And the way in which they demonstrated their faith was by literally fighting for, by the way, not necessarily fighting against other men, but fighting against demons, fighting against threats to Christian society, fighting against dragons, fighting against these kinds of dangers that would be faced by Christian communities. They fought against them, and then, demonstrating their faith, they were martyred by the Roman Empire for their faith. And in allowing themselves to die for the faith, they were still literally fighting for the faith. So the church begins with an introduction to the literal idea of men who were so determined to demonstrate their faith in God that they were prepared to die for this even though they were military men. So you begin with quite literal warrior saints. But then you move into the second part of the church, and in this nave, which is also covered by a dome, the images are not of warrior saints, but rather they are the warriors or athletes for Christ that John Climacus was talking about. That is, monastic saints, who demonstrated their own almost martial valor, not by engaging in combat on behalf of the faith, but by engaging in this very unique vocation of monasticism. And this is something that is very common in the Eastern Orthodox traditions and in Coptic Christianity in relationship to monasticism. The idea of a close link between warrior saints and then monastic saints who simply represent a different kind of activity on behalf of God, a different way of displaying your almost martial valor, not in military terms, but rather in very different terms, in monastic terms. You find this very, very commonly in Coptic churches. So, St. John Climacus begins by introducing us very briefly to the idea of monks, and then he begins to describe the 30 steps that a monk must follow in order to make his way into heaven. There are 30 of them. I am not going to read over all of them, and as it is, I've digested out a few, but I want you to get a flavor of his writing. For example, the first step on the pathway to heaven if you're a monk is the renunciation of life. No one, said St. John, can enter into the heavenly chamber without first making 3 renunciations. He has to turn away from worldly concerns, from men and from family. That's number 1. Number 2, he must cut selfishness away. And thirdly, he must rebuff the vanity that follows obedience. The second step is detachment. If you truly love God and long to reach the kingdom that is to come, if you are truly pained by your failings and are mindful of the punishment and of eternal judgment, if you are truly afraid to die, then it will not be possible to have an attachment or anxiety or concern for money, for possessions, for family relations, for worldly glory, for love and brotherhood, indeed for anything of earth. All worry about one's condition, even for one's body, must be pushed aside as hateful. You must detach yourself from everything that is associated with normal settled life if you want to make your way up that ladder to heaven. Thirdly, exile. Exile is an irrevocable renunciation of everything in one's familiar surroundings that hinders one from attaining the ideal of holiness. Fourth, obedience. Obedience is the total renunciation of our own life. Obedience is the mortification of the body's members while the mind remains alive. That's important, by the way. Whatever in the process of demonstrating obedience involves suffering on your own part, it actually allows your mind to flourish. Your mind remains alive by the very act of obedience, he argues. Obedience is unquestioned movement, death freely accepted, a simple life, danger faced without worry, an unprepared defense before God, fearlessness before death, a safe voyage, a sleeper's journey. To obey is, with all deliberateness, to put aside the capacity to make one's own judgment. That last sentence, by the way, is, again, it's a complex one. Because what he says is, in obeying, you set aside your own judgment in order to do what you're told to do. But you do this deliberately. Nobody is making you do it. If you are a true monk, you choose to do this, because this is part of the way to make your way on forward. This, by the way, is another painting, and it's out of place, I must say, but nonetheless, it's an example of a listing of the monastic monks that you'll find in that second part of the church. But let me return, okay, here we are. Sorry about that. Number 5, penitence. Number 6, remembrance of death. Number 7, mourning. And mourning is a melancholy of the soul, a disposition of an anguished heart that passionately seeks what it thirsts for, and when it fails to attain it, pursues it diligently and follows it, lamenting bitterly. Placidity and meekness. Malice, number 9, down at the bottom. I quite like the terminology that St. John uses here. Malice is like worms that thrive in a rotten tree. Malice thrives in the deceptively meek and silent. He who has expelled malice has found forgiveness, but he who hugs it is deprived of mercy. Slander. What he's doing, by the way, is listing steps that involve not doing certain things. That is, avoiding malice, avoiding slander. Slander is the offspring of hatred, a subtle yet crass disease. You can always recognize people who are malicious and slanderous. They are filled with the spirit of hatred. Gladly and without a qualm, they slander the teaching, the doings, and the virtues of their neighbor. I have known men who secretly had committed very grave sins and had not been found out, and yet cloaked in their supposed goodness, they lashed out against people who had done something minor in public. To pass judgment on another is to usurp shamelessly a prerogative of God, and to condemn is to ruin one's own soul. I'm reading some of these, by the way, because when you read your way through them, a lot of these they're not just common sense, they've entered into popular discourse. On the other hand, they were not invented by St. John. You can find versions of this that will go back into the writings of the Sumerians, the Babylonians, and the Egyptians. But here, he brings this together as a way of explaining what it is that monks should do, how a monastic life should be led. Number 11. This, by the way, is the one that I will be violating for the next 45 minutes. Talkativeness and silence. Talkativeness is the throne of vain glory on which it loves to preen itself and show off. Talkativeness is a sign of ignorance, a doorway to slander, a leader of jesting, a servant of lies, the ruin of compunction, a summoner of despondency, the end of vigilance, the cooling of zeal, the darkening of prayer. But intelligent silence is the mother of prayer. It is freedom from bondage. It is the custodian of zeal. It is a guard on our thoughts, a watch on our enemies, a friend in time of tears, a concern with judgment, a servant of anguish, a foe of license, a companion of stillness, the opponent of dogmatism, a growth of knowledge, a hand to shape contemplation. For the man who recognizes his sins has taken control of his tongue, while the chatterer has yet to discover himself as he should. It is hard to keep water in without a dike, but it is harder still to hold in one's tongue. He who succeeds in doing so has with one blow cut off a host of evils. I have to admit, I quite like that, even though this is something that I seem to violate every day and every hour of my life. But I do try to keep it at least in mind and then repent of what it is that I'm doing. These are other of the steps. Things to avoid or things to do. You must avoid falsehood, despondency, gluttony. You must practice chastity. You must avoid avarice. You must practice poverty. You must avoid insensitivity. You must give yourself over to sleep, prayers, the singing of psalms. You must show alertness, courage, but avoid vainglory and pride. You must show meekness, simplicity, guilelessness, but avoid wickedness. You must show humility. You must show discernment. And you must show stillness. I particularly like this one, by the way, which is why I'm going to read it. Stillness of the body is the accurate knowledge and management of one's own feelings and perceptions. Stillness of the soul is the accurate knowledge of one's thoughts and is an unassailable mind. And I like that distinction between stillness of the body and stillness of the soul. The start of stillness is the rejection of all noisiness as something that will trouble the depths of the soul. But the final point is reached when one has no longer a fear of noisy disturbance because one is immune to it. I really do like that as a definition of what he means by monastic stillness. Again, it's something I wish I could practice a little bit more often than I do. Prayer. Prayer is by nature a dialogue and a union of man with God. Its effect is to hold the world together, which is why embedded in monasticism is the obligation of monks to pray for themselves, for their brothers, and for the vast majority of Christians who cannot be monks, who live in their communities, in Egypt, down in the Nile Valley, for example, and even for non-Christians. Dispassion is the 29th step, and then the final step, faith, hope, and love. And now at last is St. John. After all that has been said, there remains that triad, faith, hope, and love, binding and securing the union of all. To me they appear. One is a ray, one is light, and one is a disk, and all is a single radiance and a single splendor. The first can make and create all things. That's faith. The mercy of God encircles the second. That's hope, and keeps it from confusion, while the third, which is love, never falls and never halts on its way. This is what the monastic life is supposed to be about. A life lived separate from a lay community, by men who are demonstrating a warrior's zeal by practicing these things, by trying to follow this path. And for them, and for all, it is as difficult a path to follow as it is for a warrior to live up to his own responsibilities. That's why the monks are the athletes of Christ. That's why they are the warriors of Christ. So, St. John is writing at the beginning of the 7th century. And by the beginning of the 7th century, a vast Christian institution has grown up, built around the implementation of these principles. This is Christian monasticism. But this is the beginning of the 7th century. Where does the institution come from, and where does this conception of a religious life come from? Well, one way to answer that question is to go back about 300 years, 400 years before the time of St. John Climacus, to another figure of enormous significance in the history of Christianity, a man named St. Basil, known by many Christians around the world as St. Basil the Great. St. Basil the Great was born somewhere, we think, around the year 330 of the Common Era. He was not an Egyptian, by the way, although he is a very important figure in the Coptic Church today. For whatever it is worth, several years ago, the AUC Press published the Coptic Liturgy of St. Basil. That's the guy that we're talking about. St. Basil was an important figure in the church before the split between what would become Coptic Christianity and what would become Greek Orthodox Christianity. So he remains an important figure in the Egyptian church as well as the Greek church at large. So, St. Basil in the 330s was born he's born in the central parts of what is today Turkey, in a region called Cappadocia. He was a young man at a moment when Christianity had just been made a legal religion by the Roman Emperor Constantine, when Christianity is now, for the first time, a powerful political force in the Roman Empire, as well as a rapidly growing religious, cultural, and social force. He was born to Christian parents. He was fascinated by the Christian message, and he was searching for ways to try to better understand God and to try to better live a life that would be in accord with the will of God. And so, when he was in his late teens and early 20s, he went on a religious quest, which, by the way, for the last 2,000 years and for 1,000 years before, lots of young men with the same kinds of concerns have done. But St. Basil, on his quest, went to two places in particular. First, he traveled south to Syria and Palestine, because he knew that there was flourishing a very strange phenomenon, monasticism, that was characterized by individual Christians who had given up everything they possessed, left their homes, abandoned their families in many cases, and then gone off to the edges of towns and cities, gone even into the desert, where they lived in caves, where they subjected themselves to enormous privations, beating themselves hour after hour on end. Some of them chose to live on top of tall rocks. Some even chose to live on top of tall pillars. And what they were doing was, on the one hand, so strange in demonstrating their willingness to be warriors for Christ, but still so impressive in what they were willing to undergo to demonstrate their faith, that they began to acquire a following and their reputation spread out of their own area. And so St. Basil went there to see what was going on, and he was fascinated by these figures. He saw this as an example of what truly inspired Christians can do, but he also saw it as something that was, for him, too extreme. I mean, it's all well and good to decide to live your entire life sitting on top of a pillar, as a number of very famous Christian saints did in Syria and Palestine. But is this really a vocation for a community? Is it a way in which large numbers of men who wish to live a special religious vocation could demonstrate their special adherence to God's will? And so he traveled on, and he came to Egypt. And he spent several years in Egypt, and there he encountered something else. That is a different kind of monasticism. And when he went back to Turkey, he sat down and, inspired most of all by what he encountered in Egypt, he began to draw up a way of life that involved men and women as well, in special circumstances, separate from men, withdrawing away from normal lay society in search of solitude where they could live a life completely dedicated to serving God. But doing this within communities. What he did was to write the monastic rule that to this day governs monasticism in Greek Orthodoxy. It is called the Rule of St. Basil, and it is the basis of Greek Orthodox monasticism and of monasticism in all of the Eastern Orthodox traditions that are linked up with Greek Orthodoxy. And while it is a little bit different in some ways from what Basil encountered in Egypt, it was directly inspired by what he saw in Egypt. I'm not going to read through, by the way, Basil's rule, but I do want to acquaint you with St. Basil, who I think is one of the great spiritual figures of history. Basil wrote a series of letters to colleagues of his. And in these letters, he described what he meant by calling for this life of solitude. I won't read through all of the words that are here, but let me just begin. What we ought to do, he said, and what would enable us to keep close to the footsteps of him who pointed the way to salvation is this. We must try to keep the mind in tranquility. But every day brings with it some particular cloud to darken the soul, and every night takes over the cares of the day, diluting the mind with the same cares and fantasy. There is but one escape from all of this: separation from the world altogether. But withdrawal from the world does not necessarily mean bodily removal from it. And when he says that, by the way, he really means death. Withdrawal from the world means the severance of the soul from sympathy with the body, and the giving up of city, home, personal possessions, love of friends, property, means of subsistence, business, social relations, and knowledge derived from human teaching. It also means the readiness to receive in one's own heart the impressions engendered there by divine instruction. Now, to this end, solitude gives us the greatest help, since it calms our passions and gives reason to leisure. It gives reason leisure to sever them completely from the soul. For just as animals are easily subdued by caresses, so desire, anger, fear, and grief, the venomous evils which beset the soul, if they are lulled to sleep by solitude and are not exasperated by constant irritations, are more easily subdued by the influence of reason. He sought and argued for the possibility of Christians withdrawing into solitude, where they could give themselves over to contemplations of the divine, to prayer, to working together towards a common purpose. And then he went on to describe this. Now, once again, I'm not going to read through all of this, but I'll ask you to briefly look at this text. He has some general statements, but he also has a series of very specific prescriptions like this. In general, he says, just as one should consider practical utility in the matter of clothing, so too in the matter of food. Bread will satisfy actual needs, water will cure thirst if one is healthy, and there are besides all the dishes of vegetables and fruits that help to preserve the body's strength for inevitable needs. And one should not exhibit frantic gluttony in eating, but on all occasions should preserve composure, gentleness, and restraint as regards the pleasure of the palate. And not even at table should one allow the mind to be unoccupied with thoughts of God, but one should make the very nature of the food and the structure of the body that receives it an occasion for his glorification. Before meals, let prayers be said worthy of the bounties which God both gives us now and is stored up for the future. Now, he goes on about this, and he talks about dress, he talks about food, he talks about life, he talks about being together. And he talks about here in a solitude where men are withdrawn to live together, to follow the rules that he lays out. It becomes possible for all of them to strive to achieve a closer understanding of God, a better way for them of trying to come to terms with the will of God. Actually, by the way, when you read through this letter of St. Basil's, and forgive me if what I say sounds flippant because I don't mean it that way, but he almost makes it sound as if monasticism, that is withdrawing into one of these separate communities, is the greatest summer camp ever developed. You leave the city behind, you go off into solitude. There, you no longer have the cares that you face when you're back at home. There you can give yourself over to reason, you can give yourself over to contemplation. It's the ideal circumstance. And by the way, today in many Christian traditions, many lay Christians, and this is certainly true in the Coptic Church in Egypt, will go off to solitude, go to the monasteries on weekends, so they can at least experience a moment of this kind of withdrawal from the common evils and problems that everyone faces day by day. Now, what St. Basil wrote was directly inspired by what he encountered in Egypt, which then raises the obvious question: what did he encounter in Egypt? Well, the obvious answer is monasticism. And in a form that he found he could take with him, which was not the case with the kind of monasticism that he found in Syria and Palestine, which is built around individual warriors and athletes of Christ who were so extreme in the way in which they were practicing their vocations that it was something that he found fascinating, but not suited for the kind of community that he hoped to become part of. It was a communal form of withdrawal, a communal form of monasticism that St. Basil encountered in Egypt. And he took it back with him, and it inspired his own idea of monasticism. Communal monasticism, not just in the Greek Orthodox tradition, but in every Christian tradition that has experienced monasticism. Communal monasticism in Roman Catholicism, as well as Greek Orthodoxy, Russian Orthodoxy, Syrian Orthodoxy, every single one of them was ultimately inspired in the 4th century by a direct encounter by someone with the experience of monasticism in Egypt, either by going to Egypt themselves or by reading texts that came out of Egypt describing what was going on in Egypt. So what was this phenomenon in Egypt, and how did it get started? For much of the last 2 centuries, scholars who have been interested in the origins of monasticism have speculated on how monasticism began in Egypt. One common interpretation that's been offered, which I find is no longer as prominent, but which still is one to consider, is that the roots of Christian monasticism actually lie in phenomenon that you find within Judaism. Let me direct your attention to this passage from the Old Testament. This comes from the book of Numbers. In it, speak to the Israelites and say to them, if a man or woman wants to make a special vow, a vow of separation to the Lord as a Nazirite. The term Nazirite seems to describe this practice of separating away on behalf of the Lord. He must abstain from wine and other fermented drink during the entire period of his vow of separation. No razor may be used to his head. He must be holy until the period of his separation to the Lord is over. He must let the hair of his head grow long. And throughout the period of his separation to the Lord, he must not go near a dead body. Throughout the period of his separation, he is consecrated to the Lord. Many interested in the origins of monasticism will point to this text as evidence of a phenomenon that we have evidence of within Christianity, of a special kind of separation by certain Jews who sought to consecrate themselves to God for a period of time by separation, by withdrawal, and by subjecting themselves to special privations. Now, this is in Numbers. What does this have to do with Egypt? Well, this is a very bad scanned image from a 16th century copy of a text written by a 1st century of the Common Era philosopher named Philo Judaeus. I do not know if any of you are familiar with him. I'm sure that some of you are, and some of you I know are very familiar with him. Philo Judaeus is one of the 4 or 5 greatest philosophers of the Greco-Roman period in general. Not limited to Egypt, but everywhere where Greece and Rome and the culture of Greece and Rome was prominent. Philo Judaeus, however, was a citizen of Alexandria. He spent most of his productive life in Alexandria. He was a leading figure of the Jewish community in Alexandria. He flourished there in the first half century of the Common Era. We're not exactly certain when he was born. He may have been born just about the time that Jesus Christ was born. We know that the greatest era of productive activity was in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s of the Common Era. And we know that he was a major figure in Alexandria and a leader of the Jewish community in Alexandria. Now, this is important because Philo lived in Egypt and was a witness to what was going on in Judaism in the Egypt of his day, which was the 1st century of the Common Era, when Rome has just taken control of Egypt. And in one of his works, which is called The Contemplative Life, Philo wrote about Well, he wrote about a group of figures within the body of Judaism in Egypt that scholars have been speculating about ever since. Once again, I don't have time to read through all of this, but let me read some of the salient points of what he said. I therefore will now say something that is appropriate to be said about these people who have embraced contemplation. They are most fitly called therapeutai, that literally translated means healers, and therapeutridae, which is a feminine form, so it's both men and women. Out of their yearning after the immortal and the blessed life, they esteem their mortal life to have already ended, and so leave their possessions to their sons or daughters, or in default of them to other kinsmen of their own free will, leaving to these their heritage in advance. And if they have no kinsmen, they leave it to their comrades and friends. And as soon as they have divested themselves of their properties, without allowing anything to further ensnare them, they flee, they leave, they go away without turning back, having abandoned brethren, children, wives, parents, and all the throng of their kindred, which sounds very much like that passage in St. Basil 400 years later about giving up all of your associations. However, they do not go to live in another city, that is, leave Alexandria to go to another city, for every city, even the best governed, teems with riots and troubles untold, which no one would endure that had once let himself be led by wisdom. Rather do they make for themselves their settlements outside the walls of the city, in gardens or solitary cots, seeking solitude, not from any harsh or deliberate hatred of mankind, but knowing that the intercourse with and the influence of those unlike them in character cannot profit them, but can only harm them. The best people from all parts, as if they were going to the native country of the therapeutai, leave their homes and emigrate to a certain spot most suitable, which is located above the Mareotic Lake, upon a low hill, very conveniently placed for both its security and well-tempered climate. He goes on to describe their simple dwellings. He goes on to describe how in every dwelling there's a special place where they go to pray. They can't bring in food, they can't bring in drink, they simply go to contemplate the holy texts. And he talks about how they continue to do this. They create their own vision of things to help them so that they will remember God and never forget God. And that this, by the way, applies to men and women, but they each have their own separate places. They pray the entire interval from dawn to evening, he says. This is at the bottom of the text. And it's given up by them to spiritual exercises. Which, by the way, sounds to many very much like what monasticism would be several centuries later. Now, one interesting thing is that he is writing in the 1st century of the Common Era in Alexandria. He is talking about groups of Jews who withdraw into a solitary community, settled into a kind of personal solitude. And the point he's talking about is, and many of you will know this as Lake Mariut. It's the lake that lies right behind Alexandria. This is the ancient Lake Mareotis that he was talking about. And what is interesting is that 300 years later, two of the earliest centers of Christian monasticism would be not very far away. In an area called Kelia, along the western sides of the Nile Delta, and then in the area of Wadi Natron, that I know a number of you are familiar with, just off the Cairo-Alexandria desert, just to the west of that Cairo-Alexandria highway, just to the west of that highway, about halfway between Cairo and Alexandria. And the proximity of these locations, his description of the therapeutai, leads many to believe that this is a sort of informal institutionalization of that idea of separation and solitude in Judaism that might very well have inspired Christian monasticism. It may well have, but there are some problems. Forgive me now, because I need to ask you to look at the timeline that I put up here. Judaism came to Egypt in a substantial way. It was present earlier, but it came in a substantial way in the 3rd century BCE, when the Greek kings called the Ptolemies took over Egypt after the death of Alexander the Great. By the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, there is a large and flourishing Jewish community in Alexandria. And between 20 and 50 of the Common Era, one of the great figures of this community is Philo Judaeus, and he describes the therapeutai in what would be the 20s, 30s, or 40s of the Common Era. But here's the problem. One, we know that Christianity came into Egypt just about the time that Philo was describing the therapeutai. Unfortunately, although there are many important legends that the Coptic Church maintains, we have very few details about the actual history of the early development of Christianity in Egypt in this period. There are a number of scholars, by the way, who believe that the very slim evidence suggests that the earliest form of Christianity in Egypt was actually a form of Jewish Christianity. I won't go into details about this, but basically Jewish Christianity means that to be a Christian, you must follow all of the Jewish law. And we know from the New Testament and from the Acts of the Apostles that in Jerusalem, Jewish Christianity flourished at the same time that the Apostle Paul, who was operating off in Turkey and Greece, was advocating a different kind of Christianity where one could be a Christian without following the Jewish law. Well, many scholars believe that it was Jewish Christianity that was established first in Egypt, but the evidence is not very good. One thing we do know is this, however. Between 115 and 130 of the Common Era, there were a series of massive revolts and even wars in Libya to the west and in Egypt that involved some kind of revolt or rebellion on the part of the large Jewish communities established in those areas against the Romans. Egypt was a province of the Roman Empire at that time. And we have only bare reflections of what these revolts were, but they seem to have been a devastating series of events. We wish we had more detail. But by the middle of the 2nd century of the Common Era, Judaism is no longer a major force in Egypt. It was not a dominant force beforehand, but it was a large and prominent part of the mix of Hellenistic or Greco-Roman Egypt. In the second half of the 2nd century AD, the community seems to have been, if not completely destroyed, then devastated by the wars, and they seem to have been almost completely suppressed by the Romans. Jews would continue to live in Egypt for centuries to come, but they would no longer represent the kind of community that Philo was part of. Now, that means that by 130 or so, it doesn't appear as if there was a substantial Jewish community in Egypt. And while there are Christians in Egypt, one, we don't know very much about them at this time, and two, we are fairly certain that nothing like monasticism had yet begun to develop. And that means there's a hiatus. As of 200 of the Common Era, we begin to get documents that make it plain that Pauline Christianity, that is the kind of Christianity that St. Paul advocated, was now reasonably well established and well known in Egypt, as it was throughout much of the rest of the Roman Empire at this time. But we know still relatively few details about it. And in fact, one of the things most scholars are concerned about is that the dominant religious expressions in Egypt at this time would have been surviving forms of traditional Egyptian religion and other pagan cults. It is very unlikely, as of 200 of the Common Era, that even 5% of the population of Egypt had become Christian. If that number was achieved, that's a substantial number. But that means that Christianity was not yet a powerful force in Egypt. The 3rd century of the Common Era is the era in which Christianity will grow rapidly and steadily and powerfully in Egypt. And by the way, it happens not only in Egypt, but all over the Roman Empire. The reasons for this are many. This is not the time or place to address that. I just need to emphasize two things right now. It is in the 3rd century of the Common Era that Christianity takes off in Egypt in the sense of winning an increasingly large number of adherents. So much so that by the year 300, it's probably fair to say that Christianity had more adherents than any other cult or religious expression in Egypt. It may not yet have represented a majority of Egyptians, but it was now a powerful cultural and social and political force in Egypt. That happens in the 3rd century. That's the first thing. The second thing is very important. It's in the 3rd century that monasticism begins in Egypt. And there's a corollary to that second thing. Every bit of evidence that we have from all of the stories and all of the tales makes one thing explicitly clear. When monasticism begins in Egypt, it does not begin in Alexandria, it does not begin in Memphis, it does not begin in the other great Greco-Roman cities of Egypt. It begins in the towns and villages in Egypt inhabited by the Egyptian peasantry. Monasticism is not a product in its origins of Greco-Roman or Hellenistic civilization. It will take on many aspects of that as time moves along. But in Egypt, and at the same time in Syria and Palestine, it begins as a movement within the body of the Egyptian peasantry. And the spread of Christianity into the rural parts of Egypt cannot be extricated from the spread of Christianity from the spread of monasticism in the 3rd century. All of the great early monks whom we know of in the Egyptian Christian tradition were peasants. Later on, you get sons of emperors who come to Egypt to become monks, but not at the beginning. At the beginning, you're dealing with the sons of landowners in villages. You're dealing with peasants who are facing the same problems that peasants in villages all over the Roman Empire would have faced. And for some reason, these peasant figures decided to give up the life that they were leading and troop off into the desert to become the first monks. This, by the way, is one of my favorite paintings in the world. This is in the Prado Museum. It's a painting by the great 17th century Spanish painter Velázquez, and it shows two of the most famous of the early saints in Egypt, St. Paul and St. Anthony, who are supposed to have met at the end of their lives when each of them was 100 years old and more. That's St. Anthony on the left, St. Paul on the right. This is very much an image in the Western artistic tradition. These are the same two figures on the walls of the great church of St. Anthony in a painting from the 14th century. But both of these figures came from rural backgrounds in Egypt. And most of the other great saints on the walls of the Church of St. Anthony, the great Church of St. Anthony in the Red Sea Mountains, and many of the early great saints of the Coptic tradition, all of them come from rural backgrounds, and the stories of how they became monks are very much the stories of rural environments. For example, over here in the right center of this photograph are three early saints called St. Mccarrans. One of them is St. Mccarrans the Great, who is associated with the establishment of monasticism in Wadi Natron. A monastery in Wadi Natron is still named after him. Well, the story of St. Mccarrans the Great, which is one of my favorite stories, involves him living in his village right along the edges of the western part of the Nile Delta. He's a young man. He's increasingly fascinated by God. He wants to find a vocation in which he gives himself over to God. He's heard about St. Anthony and some of these other figures in other rural parts of Egypt who have decided to emulate Christ by going off into the desert. Now, he doesn't do that at the beginning, but he decides that he will go and sit under a tree outside of his village and spend much of the day, many days in a row, sitting there, praying, contemplating, meditating. And the story's about to make a plain. Everybody thought this was really weird. And one of the stories says, one of the young women fell in love with him. It's a rather sexist story, by the way, as many of these are. But one of the young women fell in love with him. She went to him, professed her love, and he said, I'm sorry, I've given myself over to the contemplation of God. Which he took, by the way, as a really nasty rejection. So she went back to the village, and a few months later she said, A, I'm pregnant, and B, it is the monk who has made me pregnant, that man sitting out on the edge of the city. And so everyone went out, day after day, they threw things at him. Day after day, they said, you must marry this woman. And he said, I will marry her, but that's only because she needs a husband. I am not the one who is responsible. And so people grew angrier and angrier at him. And at the very end of all of this, 8 months pass, 9 months pass, 10 months pass, 12 months pass, 14 months pass, and there's no child. And everybody realizes that she had just made up the story to force him to marry her. And at that point, according to the story, the whole village goes out to him and says, hey, I mean, we're sorry, I mean, you truly are special. And this is not an exact quote, but St. Mccarrans at that point says to them, okay, I've had it with all of you people. I'm going out into the desert on my own. And so he goes into Wadi Natron and becomes one of the first great anchorites, or one of the first great saints out there. This is part of the early tradition. And I know we're getting late, and I'm scheduled to finish at 7:30, and we stopped a little bit late. I started a little bit late, so I'll ask you if you could be kind enough to bear with me. But I will try to finish this up at that point, but I want to begin with this statement. What I've said is, monasticism begins in Egypt among the rural peasantry. Given the timing that I showed you in the chart, the timing related to the flourishing of Judaism and the destruction of Egyptian Judaism in the 120s and 130s by the Roman emperors. And then given the fact that Philo was talking about a phenomenon happening among relatively well-to-do Jews living in Alexandria, when monasticism begins 200 years later in the rural parts of Egypt, it becomes difficult to see a direct link between a practice in early Judaism, or even in Judaism of the 1st century AD, and the origins of monasticism in the rural parts of Egypt. There may have been indirect links there, and those links do come through the person of Jesus, but I think the more direct link has to do with passages like this. Because when these inhabitants of the rural parts of Egypt began to troop off into the desert in the 2nd, 3rd century of the Common Era to become athletes for Christ, What they were striving to do was to emulate Jesus, which, by the way, is what they were told to do in the holy text. Here is Philippians, one of the letters of St. Paul. Your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus, who, being in the very nature of God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. If Jesus was prepared to humble himself, well, if you wish to be a Christian, you should be prepared to humble yourself. But then how does this relate to emulating Jesus, humbling yourself if you live in a rural village in Egypt? This, by the way, is where I think there is a very special link between the gospel texts and other early religious texts in the Christian tradition and the environment of rural Egypt and rural Palestine and Syria at the same time. When you read the New Testament Gospels, you are reading about a community and an environment that Egyptian Christians, probably not reading this because many would have been illiterate, but hearing this, being told to them by those who could read, that Egyptian Christians living in the rural parts of Egypt in the 3rd century would have immediately recognized. An environment of villages and towns, of itinerants moving back and forth between these towns, and an environment where the desert was ever present, just a short distance away. Any of you who have been to Palestine or Syria know that the desert there is a little bit different in the way in which it interacts with the geography of settled society from Egypt. But still, there's hardly any place in the hill country, over the mountains of Syria and Palestine, that's not more than a few hours or a half day or a day's walk from a desert environment. The desert was always there. And when rural Egyptian Christians, or those interested in Christianity, began to hear about Christ and his disciples and moving back and forth, going out into the desert, coming back in again, about people living in that environment, about the kind of parables he was telling, well, they may not have been attracted immediately to the high philosophical ideas of Christianity that St. Paul and others were establishing and had become part of the Christian tradition in the 3rd century. I think they were responding in part to the reality of what they came to believe was God coming down and living among them in a community that they understood. A community where, amongst other things, the desert was ever present. These are 2 passages from the New Testament, from Matthew and John. The first one, by the way, is where Christ is predicting all sorts of tribulations to come. But notice how he does this. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, which was a desert environment. Let no one on the roof of his house go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get his cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight. The word in Greek, by the way, describing this flight to get away from tribulations is the word anaphorosis, which means to leave, to go away. Pray that your flight will not take place in the winter on the Sabbath, for then there will be great distress, unequal from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. If anybody tells you, there he, and this is Jesus, there he is out in the desert, do not go out. Or here he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. Well, the reason I'm mentioning this is that here is Jesus talking about things that are going to happen after his death. Terrible events are going to take place, but it's put into the context that the desert is over there. Your house is over here. You've got problems. Get out of your village and go off there to the mountains and the hills and get away from it. The relationship between town and village and desert, which is part of the New Testament, is also characteristic of the rural environment in Egypt. And if you want to emulate Christ in that environment, as the earliest monks did, you look at a moment where Jesus went out into the desert so that he could in fact struggle against the devil. This is the famous incident of Jesus withdrawing into the wilderness, the desert, where the devil then tempted him. This is described in Mark, in Matthew, in Luke. Jesus goes out into the desert. There he is tempted, and he overcomes the blandishments of the devil. And this is what the earliest monks in Egypt were seeking to do. They were emulating Jesus in the best way they could, doing what he did in his own environment, which was trooping off into the desert, where they sought to struggle against the devil in the same way that Jesus did. And the stories of the early saints, like St. Anthony, are full of temptations that the great saints overcome, and those who do not become saints fail to overcome. This is how monasticism begins in Egypt, and this is how it begins in Syria and Palestine. But this is where I need to go back to that word that I mentioned a little bit earlier. That word anaphorosis, which you see at the bottom here. This is a Greek word that means withdrawing, leaving, separating away. This is what the earliest monks were doing. And this first phase in the history of monasticism is a phase to which we give the term anchorite or anchoritic. And we call it Incretism. When individuals simply withdrew from settled society, they fled away from the tribulations of normal life to go off into the desert to emulate Christ. This is not the kind of monasticism that St. Basil carried away from Egypt with him. And the fact that it was not is that when St. Basil came to Egypt in the 350s of the Common Era, a type of monasticism had evolved out of anchoritic monasticism that was communal and exportable. This is what we call cenobitic monasticism, from the two Greek words koinos and bios, common life. And to understand this, and we'll be finishing with this, you need to understand a little bit about this map. At the beginning of the 4th century of the Common Era, monasticism, in the form of anchorites trooping off into the desert, has become a powerful force on either side of the Nile Valley, opposite all of the concentrations of rural population. You have sites that later on will become the sites of great monasteries, many of which are still monasteries today, like the ones marked on this map. But there were two sites in particular of significance. One in the north, in the Wadi Natron area, where St. Mccarrans the Great, by the way, went. And one in the south, in the area called the Thebaid. By the way, if you ever read anything about monasticism, the term Thebaid constantly comes up. The Thebaid is the area north and south of the city of Thebes, modern Luxor. It's that stretch of the Nile Valley, north and south of it, roughly within the circle that I've drawn here. And around the year 300 or 310 AD, an Egyptian who had been for several years an anchorite, living out in the desert by himself, came back into the Nile Valley, inspired by the idea that while being a hermit and subjecting yourself to impossible privations is a proper vocation for some, he had spent time in the desert watching dozens of men troop off in the desert and literally commit suicide because they weren't able to survive on their own in the desert. And to him, that was not a religious vocation, that was suicide, and suicide is a sin against God's will. And he had seen these men starving and dying in the desert, with monks living solitary lives around them, not doing a thing to help out their colleagues who were dying. And that he regarded as a sin as well. He felt there must be some way that you can preserve the idea of the individual withdrawing into solitude, but in a way where individuals can do this in a community, where they can support one another, where they can work together, and critically, he felt that if you withdrew from your town and village in the Nile Valley, the life that you were taking up was a privilege. Yes, it was going to be a difficult life, but only the most privileged individuals have the right to do this. And if it's a privilege, you owe something to all of those other Christians who cannot withdraw, who have lives that must be led and families that must be taken care of. And he was imbued with the idea that there must be some way where monasticism could become a community of monks who would serve one another, preserving the life of solitariness, and at the same time provide leadership to the communities down in the Nile Valley. This is this man's name, Pachomius. This is a painting of him in the great church of St. Anthony. I would argue that this is one of the most influential Egyptians who has ever lived. I say that, by the way, not making a positive or negative judgment about the institution of monasticism, but anyone who knows anything about the history of Western Europe, about Eastern Christianity in the Middle Ages, and of the overwhelming significance of monasticism in those areas, it is immediately obvious that the kind of monasticism that flourished outside of Egypt, became part of the Christian tradition, was incredibly influential. And it begins with this man. I know everybody in the way is obsessed with pyramids and so on, but if you are looking for the greatest cultural export of Egyptian civilization, right up there at the top must be communal monasticism. And it is a creation of the rural peasantry, of the Egyptian peasant. And throughout Egyptian history, most Egyptians have been Egyptian peasants. Yes, it is Christian, but it is a type of Christianity that reflects the rural environment in Egypt and the needs of the rural environment in Egypt, and it is utterly Egyptian in its origins. That's what I mean by saying that Pachomius is one of the most influential Egyptians who has ever lived. He is described by other great writers at the time. This is from the text of a great church historian named Sojourn, which I will not read through, except for down at the bottom of the last page. This is right down towards the bottom, the 5th line from the bottom, after he has described a series of ways in which Pachomius organized a community of monks. These, he said, were the laws by which Pachomius ruled his own disciples. He was a man who loved humanity and was beloved of God. He resided at Tabenna in Thebais. That is, his monasticism began in the south, in the Thebaid. And by adopting these rules for their government, they, the monks of this area, became very renowned, and in the process of time increased vastly. They all observed one and the same rule of life and possessed everything in common. That rule of life survives. This is the rule of Pachomius. You can download this by the internet if you're interested, by the way. All I've done here is to exhibit a few examples of it, and much of it is extremely mundane. Look at the first one. This rule number 3. The first to enter the monastery takes the first place, whether sitting or walking, at the recital of psalms, being served at table, receiving communion. It is not the age of brothers that establish the precedence among them, but the date of their profession which counts. I mean, that's a very simple thing. It tells you who matters within the community. It's a matter of when you came into the community. It talks about how you lead your life, when you should be silent, when you should speak, how you should eat together, when you eat together, when you withdraw for common prayer, the fact that you need to work, the fact that you need to sometimes act on your own, sometimes act together, and it specifies when all of these things should happen. It also says something else. And it's the last thing that I will read with you. But I would like you to look at the very top, at rules 139 and 140. Whoever comes to the monastery must first learn what he should observe. Then, after the first instruction, when he has consented to it, he will be given 20 psalms to learn, or 2 of the apostles' epistles, or part of another book of Scripture. If he is illiterate, he shall go at the 1st, 3rd, and 6th hours to find someone who can teach him and who has been appointed for this. He shall stand before him and learn very carefully with great gratitude. Then the letters of the syllable shall be written for him, and he shall be forced to read, even if he refuses. Everyone in the monastery shall learn letters and memorize something of the Scriptures, at least the New Testament and the Psalter. If you know anything about the history of monasticism, particularly in the Western European context, the monasteries are associated with the preservation of learning. Why do monks learn how to read and write? Partly because Pachomius built this into the rules of a monastic life right at the very beginning. And this becomes part of what St. Basil carries away with him to make it part of monasticism in the Greek Orthodox tradition. Later on, St. Jerome, a great figure from the West who was living in Bethlehem, will translate the rule of Pachomius, which will make its way to Little Italy in Latin and become the basis of the development of the first monastic rules there. And many of the same prescriptions, the same demands, the same aspects of lifestyle that Pachomius or those around him wrote into the first monastic rule in Egypt become the basis of monasticism where it is established everywhere. You think of the idea of monasticism being associated with at least a type of learning. Go back to Pachomius, and the way this is built into the needs of a community that owes service to the people that it has left behind, to the lay communities of the valley. This is Pachomius, and this is the rule of Pachomius. This is why I said I was going to read a lot of text with you. Partly because you need to understand a little bit about this to understand the origins of monasticism. In all honesty, by the way, scholars could debate whether or not a man whose name really was Pachomius actually sat down and wrote these things. Many think that these were a body of rules that developed in an early community that a man named Pachomius probably really headed. Many think they were written down after his life. But it doesn't matter, because between 300 and 350 of the Common Era in Egypt, early monasticism, which starts out as a series of monks trooping off in the desert on their own, subjecting themselves to almost impossible privations, is transformed into something that is communal, something that many can engage in, something that gives back to the lay societies that the monks have left, and critically, something that is exportable. Something that can leave the Egyptian environment and then adapt itself to Christian environments everywhere around the Mediterranean world. Yet still at its heart, there's an Egyptian aspect to it. I'll end with this comment. I constantly encounter people who would listen to what I've just said and say, yeah, but it's not really Egyptian because it's Christian. I mean, what does monasticism have to do with Egypt? Okay, maybe it happened in Egypt, but it was something else. It was a different religion. Well, okay, that's true. But these are people who would also argue that there's only one way to define the word Egyptian, and that's in terms of one aspect of Egyptian history and culture and society that came to an end 2,000 years ago. That is the pharaonic aspect. I prefer not to see breaks in the history of Egypt. I prefer to see the history of Egypt as one long pageant, where Egypt develops a great civilization in the Nile Valley, but then it absorbs other civilizations and then transforms itself into something else again that is still intrinsically Egyptian. And Christian monasticism in Egypt, particularly in the Cenobitic form, in the form that Pachomius and those around him developed, is one of the great cultural inventions of Egypt. It begins here, and it's exported out of here in the 4th century. And if you'll forgive me, I'll shut up there because I've been talkative too long. I know you do question and answer. I know it's very late. I know some of you have class. If anybody wants to sit for a while, I'm happy to stay here. But please feel free to get up and walk out. It's been a long evening.
Thank you.
Could somebody turn the lights back on? Yeah. Is there anything that anybody would want to ask if you're not too exhausted? Right. Okay. Thank you all. Yeah. If I had had time, was talking a little bit about Coptic architecture, which, I mean, I'm sorry, you can't see that. Basically, by the way, what I think most people think of as traditional Coptic architecture is just as old in the Egyptian tradition as anything that the pharaohs do. If you look at, this is one of Zaki's tombs.
Oh, yes, right.
Well, that's the time of the pyramid. Or that's in the tomb of Rekhmeda, these little storehouses. Or the Ramesseum, where you have vaulted chambers. And then at Baqawat, where this now is transferred into the shallow brick domes that are part of the cemeteries there, which are still used all over Middle Egypt. I don't know if you've seen Zoe at Basil. I think that, by the way, this is the most beautiful, overwhelming site in Egypt. But this idea of using these brick domes and vaults goes all the way back to the beginning of Egyptian history. And even if I'm overdoing it, if one accepts the rural origins, I mean, they're going to draw inspiration on what they know, which is not the remnants of the huge stone buildings and the pharaohs. It's going to be what they're used to, which is basically the traditional rural architecture of Egypt. And it's not Nubian. It's just something that bridges Upper Egypt and then the lands in the south. So, I mean, that would have been the coda, and I wish I could have done that, but I already went too long. So thank you. It's a pleasure to meet you. I don't have one, but if you permit me, I'd love to come down to the museum sometime and just see what you're doing.
My card here, and
may I? And I'll give you a call.
I'm there every day.
Okay.
Every day. Just ask for me.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Hi. if you're in the back of the room, if you'd be kind enough to be a little bit quiet, because a couple people were asking some questions. The first question had to do with, I mean, the idea of monasticism beginning as a in effect, rural or peasant phenomenon in Egypt, and what about a military connection? And that's stating it a little bit too broadly, but it is true that many of the earliest monks are military monks. And in the Egyptian tradition, that's true, with figures like St. Minos, St. George, St. Phobaemon, and lots of others, St. Mercurius, St. Victor. These are all figures who are key figures in the Egyptian synaxary of saints. And they are figures who are all martyred for the faith, round about 300 or 310 of the Common Era. There is this fascinating movement of figures who are associated with the army who are supposed to have converted. Many of their backgrounds come from all over the Middle East. They're not limited to Egypt, though some of them do come from Egypt. But on the one hand, a lot of these stories are very hard to track down right at the very beginning, in the sense of, okay, was there, if you're looking for a St. Minos figure, a St. George figure, a St. Victor figure, okay, you all know about St. George and the dragon? Okay, where was the dragon of St. George slain? Well, if you're a Syrian Christian, it happened in Syria. If you're a Turkish Christian, and there aren't very many of those anymore, but there were at one time, there were legends that associated him with Cappadocia, with the mountains of the east. If you're Egyptian Christians, the Egyptian Coptic Church sort of associates him with Syria, and yet there are legends about how the great encounter with the dragon occurs in Upper Egypt. But what's more complicated is, everybody's heard of St. George and the dragon? The dragon slaying is only attached to his story long after St. George is an important saint. And St. Victor, another one of these military saints, is associated with dragon slaying earlier on. And there are figures who come from pagan traditions who are associated with the slaying of dragons and so on. There's a lot of discussion about the legends of the warrior saints, where it's much harder to see this in a more specific historical context. This is where they come from, this is how the movement develops, than it is with Egypt, where you're dealing with figures like St. Anthony, where even if you could argue what he did is a little bit extreme, you see him coming out of a living environment in Egypt in the 3rd century. I'm not questioning that the idea of warrior saints isn't important right at the very beginning. The idea of a warrior who is obedient to his commander becomes a very strong metaphor for the idea of obedience to God, and it's one, therefore, that monks pick up right at the very beginning. I mean, if you're going to emphasize obedience, that's another reason why you link warrior saints with monastic saints. Because warrior saints, in the way in which they obey their commanders, and then when they become Christian and obey God, clearly demonstrate the virtue of obedience, and monks are supposed to do this, so the stories of the warrior saints become important. But I really do believe that when you're dealing with the development of Christianity as a mass movement in Egypt in the 3rd and 4th centuries, in the rural areas, it is a rural phenomenon. It grows out of an adaptation to the physical environment and the cultural environment of people living in these parts of Egypt.
No, I think the moving out of the community grows out of them being in a village community.
Yes.
But the actual rules which were later written and the way that they led this communal life, that is what was developed by military personnel.
Okay, did you all hear that, by the way? And I'll put that another way. It could be translated into the question of, okay, but where exactly do the individualized rules come from? I mean, might that not actually come more from a military inspiration? You have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this. The qualification I have on that is that, in principle, the idea of obedience is critical in this. But when you read the rules of St. Pachomius, they are so finely detailed to the actual physical environment of a group of monks living together in a community, that I don't see them coming out of the military environment at all. I see them, I know a number of scholars would argue when you look at this in fine detail, what you're looking at is somebody trying to organize, it's like, very bad metaphor, everyone, and those of you who are Egyptian, you will please forgive me when I do this, but it's like an umda in a village in the 19th century who's trying to organize everybody, and who has a degree of informal authority within the village, either because he belongs to the right family and so on, and is able to establish a series of guidelines that everybody will follow. Well, think of the abbot of a monastery, St. Pachomius at the beginning, being an umda, but who has absolute authority over those who follow him, and now what he's doing is saying, okay, when you're going to say something at dinner, don't say any words. make a noise so that you get people's attention, but not so that you disrupt what everybody else is doing because they're listening to somebody read from the Bible. And some of these things are so dead practical to a group of people trying to figure out how to live together when the whole point of what they're doing is to not live together, that in some ways coming up with all of this is, first of all, very boring to read. And I don't mean that negatively, but it's like, okay, when you're weaving, be sure you do it during this hour and this hour and this hour and this hour. When you go into the church, if there's somebody in the back of the church weaving, please do not step on what they're weaving. And that is one of the rules.
Yeah.
And it is so specific to the environment that I find it hard to believe that it's not a group of people sitting down and saying, we have to figure out a way to organize ourselves. But I think the consciousness there is that, who are we going to look to for leadership? Oh, well, what we're used to is, and over there, he's kind of translating and taking the place of, if you're dealing with a community where there are still tribal influences, which may or may not have been the case in Egyptian villages, then he's the tribal elder. But if you think of the idea of what might have been the scribe of an Egyptian village going on earlier, and then once you start thinking that way, a lot of scholars will do basically follow what I've said. But you get down to the point where you say that the whole idea is to emulate Christ, but you emulate the Christ you understand. And if you're in a rural environment, you read the New Testament, and when I really started thinking this way and went back and read the Gospels, this is the kind of environment that you would have found in many parts of rural Egypt. Not rural in the sense that it's isolated in the middle of nowhere, but rural in the sense of a lot of people living together, villages over there, villages over here, itinerants going back and forth, dangerous to move along the roads because there's brigands and this and that and so on, and the stories are filled with this kind of thing. And I just see, if you're somebody from that background, it resonates, and I like that idea. But one thing, I just read one scholar who was talking about this the other day. I'm teaching a class on the late period in Egypt, and so I was just passing by a couple of books that were dealing with what we know about village organization in Pharaonic Egypt. And somebody made the comment that, there is some evidence that when you had problems in a village in ancient Egypt, and you couldn't deal with these problems any other way, what did you do? And then he used the Greek word. You did what Egyptians did 2,000 years later under the Greeks and the Romans, and then when they became monks, you practiced anachoresis. You just withdrew. You went someplace else. And withdrawing doesn't necessarily mean into the desert, but it means moving away from where you are. And there are some scholars who have argued, I think a little bit too hard, that it's the idea of withdrawing that has always been part of the Egyptian environment. And I think it has been, but in a much broader context, which is just this is part of rural life in Egypt. We do know, for example, that in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, this is when the Greeks are ruling over Egypt. And we have a lot of documentation. Much of the peasantry of Egypt was legally tied to the land that they were working. But we also know that there was a labor shortage all over Egypt at this time because of all sorts of things that the Ptolemies were engaged in developing lands in the Fayum. So, if there's a labor shortage, and you're a peasant, and you want to do better, you're going to go somewhere where you can get a better deal in terms of your services. But you're not allowed to do this legally. So what do? You simply pull up stakes and you practice anachoresis. You go off to the Fayum. And of course you're violating the law, but if there's somebody there who needs you to work his fields, first of all, they need your labor, so you can probably work out a better deal for yourself, and then secondly, they will protect you because they need you working the fields. So this idea of withdrawal, just, when things get too heavy, or when there are other things you need to do because you want to achieve something, is simply moving away. Well, that's not only what happened in Egypt. You find a lot of passages in the New Testament where Jesus and the early apostles and communities around them withdraw out into the desert. They do anachoresis. There's one passage in John where Jesus has learned that they're going to come to kill him. This is just, by the way, before he goes to Jerusalem, where he will be arrested and killed. And in the Gospel of John, Jesus is very knowing about what's going to happen. And he knows there's a moment when it's supposed to happen, and it's not right now. So what does he do? The passage says he withdrew out to a village right at the edge of the desert, so that those who were trying to kill him, and the implication is, would not be able to find him. And then he goes on to Jerusalem, and that's where the whole Passion events take place. But there again, the word anachoresis is, you live in a rural environment, and this is basically common sense, but you're going to be going off. You're going to be getting away when things get too heavy. But you're also going to be moving off when there are opportunities. And I should say that when you're a monk, yes, you're leaving settled society sometimes because it's getting too heavy for you. You're leaving settled society because This is what you think God wants you to do, and this is what Jesus did. But you're leaving settled society as well because it's a privilege to do so. This is withdrawal not because you're escaping something, it's withdrawing so that you can move into a privileged and better life. Something that others are not given the privilege to do. Monasticism is not for everybody. That's always been an understanding in Christianity. Incretism monasticism, where the hermit goes and lives on top of a pillar, that really was not for everybody. And I don't mean that to be funny, but there is a big difference. If you read the lives of the great saints, of the great early monastic saints of the Syrian and Palestinian tradition, and they're written up in dozens of books. They were very, very popular. They are not communal figures. They become famous because they do the impossible. If any of you have been to Syria, my guess is that you've probably been to Aleppo, and then you've gone off to the great cathedral that stands on the site of the pillar of St. Simon. And by the way, there were a lot of St. Simons, and they all sat on pillars. If you go to Lebanon, there's the remains of a monastery that stood on the site of a lesser St. Simon who sat on a pillar for many years. There's a Spanish director, Buñuel, I think, who did a film in which there's a scene of monks in Syria in the 4th century where there's a forest of pillars and all these guys are sitting on top of them. And yet, there's one very great scholar at Princeton who's written about this stuff at great length. His name is Peter Brown, who says that people found that so astonishing that in the 4th and 5th centuries, I mean, the governor of Syria and the whole court would go out to the pillar of St. Simon. St. Simon was an illiterate, by the way. And he's sitting up there on top of his pillar, and the governor of the province goes out to consult him about how to solve legal disputes. But the governor's no dummy. He knows that St. Simon is famous everywhere in Syria, especially in the rural areas. And if he can get St. Simon to agree with what he's saying, then, people are going to accept the judgment that he makes. And in Syria, these figures were of enormous significance, but they were individuals. They went off to live on their own. I mean, their fame became because they did the impossible. And if you're doing the impossible, it's awfully hard to organize a bunch of other people to do the same thing. Communal monasticism, and this I really do want to emphasize. Monasticism didn't begin in Egypt,